hope you don't mind me using the term crisis because it is, I can't get how bad it is. It is really, really bad. I don't have all the answers. Um, Up until recently, I was more optimistic about the role farming could play in climate and climate mitigation. The recent years where I found, so last year, where I took a call from something called it was a call from Wales, really. It was the British Society for Animal Science, and they did. I'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but this has coloured my views greatly. It was ERAMP report, which is the Environment and Rural Affairs Monitoring Modelling Programme. So this was done for Wales, but it was done by the CEH for the whole of the UK. And that was really a lot about dispelling the myths around the ability of soils to capture carbon. Now that's been reinforced by some work I've done with Hartbury, and I will talk about that throughout this, where we did some work with a prof in Hartbury, and we did a funded project this year to look at soil in the Cotswolds, and we compared that to soils in at Hartbury as well. So quite a lot came out of that. And that sort of reinforced what I learned from the ERAMP report and from Prof Bridget Emmett reported on that, and was quite concerning really on probably what we can do with our soils in the UK. So I'll move on. So there's a couple of things to think about within farming is what it can sequester, but also the emissions from farming. And I will go to those in a bit more detail, but it's quite a gap there. So looking at total emissions in agriculture, they are quite high, and it's around about 10% of total UK emissions are from farming, which is a lot. And we've worked out, I already worked this out, that comes to, on average, across all farms across the UK, over 2.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year being released. And that's this carbon that reflects losses from methane, and nitrous oxide, all of those taken into account that contribute to climate change. So what I'll talk about is the ability of soils to mitigate climate change, not about the good practices that we need to keep maintaining on soil health. So a lot of the stuff I'm talking about will be good for soil health, but won't necessarily be doing a whole lot for helping capture carbon in the soil. So that's been an eye-opener for me. So carbon sequestration, what is it? So it should be fairly simple idea, but it's what we add to the soil, or how we add carbon to the soil, which farmers do that generally in plants, having plant contact with the soil. Their exudates from the roots generally contain carbon, so having live roots in the soil are always building carbon in the soil. Residues from those plants, straw, manure, all of those contribute carbon to the soil. The downside, we're also taking it out all the time. So we're removing carbon in crops. We're losing carbon by oxidation. When we expose that soil surface, carbon's lost, and it's oxidized and lost to the system. So while we're sequestering, we're also losing. And whether there's any net gain, and I can tell you at the moment in the UK, there is no net gain from sequestering any carbon in the soil. Averagely, we are still losing carbon from our soils, which should be alarming because I don't see it in any of the reporting, and I don't see it in any of the software or any of the calculations that suggest the emissions from farming. I never see any reference to what's being lost from our soils. Now, this is a really good way of illustrating how badly we're managing our soils at the moment. So this is a little bit old now, this is 2012, but it's a fantastic satellite image. And as relevance to Gloucestershire, you can see the Severn. That brown stuff leaving the UK via the Severn is soil sediment. And that's loss of topsoil. That's our ability to grow food being lost out to sea. So I just wanted to show you that to see, look, our present management is very poor. And we know what a lot of these poor practices are. They're well documented. And these are things that expose the soil for a long time. So things like that are happening up the Severn, quite a lot of maize growing and even potato growing, where the soil is left exposed, actually after maize, and often potatoes is exposed over winter. So you'll get huge amounts of sediment coming down the river. So that's, I don't want to talk about that one much. And we'll shift on to the important bits. So this is the really important report. Very happy I'll share you with this. And this is an awful lot of changed my views completely on how I think farming can cope with what can mitigate climate change. And I think at the moment, the ability to mitigate is very, very restricted and is going to be very, very slight. We will need major changes in farming if we want to contribute to net zero. I think net zero in farming, honestly, from this outset, is going to be really, really difficult to do. So my topic as an answer to climate mitigation, it's going to be tricky. So why we've got in this mess about misunderstanding of soil. If you look at worldwide, the majority of carbon in the biosphere completely is held in soil. By far, a huge amount of the carbon is held in soil. It's 94% of it. And the rest is in the atmosphere and is in vegetation. But it's 94% is actually in carbon stocks in the soil. Now, how that's got there has got there by plants over thousands of years to achieve that level of carbon sequestration and the present carbon stocks. So plants have been on the planet for a very long time. They've been fixing carbon from photosynthesis. All you remember this from O-level biology, whatever you did, and understand this. Plants are able to take carbon out of the atmosphere, fix it into carbohydrates. A lot of those leak out into the soil, and those in different ways have been building these carbon stocks for years and years and years. So we actually got, in some areas, really, really high carbon stocks. So I think this is what's confused us for a long time, is that we've seen these incredibly high carbon stocks and thought, great, this is going to be simple. We're just going to carry on doing that. We're going to continue to sequester carbon into our soils, and there'll be an answer. We'll be fine. Don't worry about climate change. This will be easy. What we've failed to see is how slow that sequestration has been happening. It's been very happening, and particularly in the UK, where the soils are, where we're fairly cold, where we're cold and damp, soil sequestration in the UK is slow. It's very, very slow. But I'll talk a bit more later about that. At the moment, UK soils are contributing, as I've mentioned, they're contributing to climate change. They're not being an answer at all because our present soil management is poor. And that's true for the main types of soil. We've got, it's broadly split, and we've got mineral and peat soils in the UK. So the mineral soils are the commonest. The peat soils are often where we find drained fens. So they're Lincolnshire, Lancashire, the Cambridge fens. So those are very, very high carbon soils. They're organic soils, quite different to mineral soils. But both of them are quite slow in building organic carbon. It's quite slow. And what we've seen is this a very slow accumulation over time, but without realizing that we can lose it very, very quickly. So the losses are much quicker than our ability to accumulate. It's a really important thing to bear in mind. And how do those losses occur? So there's several poor practices that have led to this carbon loss. And that's been through drainage, soil tillage, overgrazing, excess fertilizer. And they're still carrying on. Sadly, I would think we can recognize good practice, but there's still an awful lot. If you look across the countryside, there's still a huge amount of this poor practice that's losing carbon from our soil. So remember, I gave a figure to you of total emissions, which was it's 2.67. That's about what we think it is, average emissions from farming. That's contributing, that's greenhouse gas emissions per hectare on farmland. The best that's occurring at the moment, the best we're achieving is about 5% of those emissions are being captured in carbon sequestration. It's not a whole lot, is it? It's not a whole lot. Okay, I'll explain a bit further on where that carbon's held in the soil. Most of our soils are mineral. We need that carbon if we're serious about climate change. We need that carbon stable and held within the soil. Peat soils, the dark soil, you can see one on the right of my images there. Peat soils lose carbon very, very easily. And there's some of our major losses of carbon are in those peat soils. And you can see on that image, wind blow that is taking that, lifting that carbon in the atmosphere. What you can't see is the oxidization of that carbon that's being lost from those peat soils. Okay, so they're huge and huge amount. They're drying out. And if you go to any of those areas, you'll be on a roadway which is meters higher than the soil below because they're drying out alarmingly fast. Now, the mineral soils, quite different. They hold carbon, they can hold the carbon much more securely in a stable form, but that's held within the clay fraction of the soil. So it's important there's a really strong link, and I've learnt this by working with Matt from Hartbury. There's a really strong link between organic matter content in a soil and its clay content. So we often map the two together now. It's proven. So the soil, the organic matter gets into the soil and in its first form, say it's added by compost or manure. That becomes a particulate in the that's mobile in the soil and is very easily lost in that particulate form. It's loosely wandering around in the soil. For it to be fixed, we need microorganisms, all of these soil organisms that process it, and then it becomes bound into the clay fraction of the soil. Now, remember, clay is tiny. Clay is so different, behaves different to sand and silt in the soil, and that it carries a charge because it's microscopic. Clay is tiny, it's microscopic. And to have that stable carbon and carbon that we can hold on to and we won't liberate back up to the atmosphere readily, it's bound against that charge. So clay content is really, really important. And adding carbon, the stuff we add quickly is also quickly lost. So if we look at, we sometimes get overexcited and we add some carbon to the soil in form of compost and manure and think, great, look at this organic matter we've built. We've just built up this really high organic matter. It's very, very short-lived. It's very short-lived in that process. It takes that time to become stabilized and then that process is lost. So we need to be very, very wary of these quick fixes, which actually don't hold carbon for any appreciable amount of time. You know, we need to have it securely fixed within the soil. Peat formation is really important. That will be really important to climate change in that peat keeps accumulating all of the time and continuously fixes carbon, much more secure way, but it very easily loses it. I've said if we drain it, we interfere, we move it around, it dries and we lose it. Let me just check on. I would say what we've done probably to UK soils is the major loss has been the ploughing up of permanent grasslands and converting that to arable land. Now that's likely to been going on for hundreds of years, even when we had oxen and horses ploughing the land. That was quite slight. What we've done, we've exaggerated that post-war with machinery, and that's an alarming rate. So we've been ploughing up permanent grassland with reasonably high carbon levels, be pretty good. But we can, as I've said, we can lose that carbon really quickly by ploughing it and exposing it to the atmosphere and oxidizing it. We've also been using that carbon for decades in growing our crops. So we've been using that stock of carbon to grow wheat, barley, oats, and that's been great. That's fantastic. But we've been depleting it slowly over that time. So we've been in this long, long, slow decline of soil carbon. So what's the point? Can we reverse that decline? And actually put our arable crops back to grassland? Possible. I've struggling finding good rates of carbon capture by habitat is really, really difficult. It's amazing how little science has been done on this and how much science that's relevant to the UK. An awful lot of papers aren't UK based. I've really struggled to find really consistent figures that suggest how well arable back to grassland will capture carbon. So I've got a range. It's really difficult because so many factors will affect the rates of carbon sequestration. So the range I've got here from that IRAMP paper is 0.04 to 0.4 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. If you remember what I said about total emissions, they're 2.67 tons. So that is coming nowhere near to meeting total emissions from farming. So to do that, even if we reverted all our arable land back to grassland, the process would be really, really slow. Now there's also a downside to that, is that we're taking land out of production. So if we then need bread as part of our diet, we need to import wheat. So all we're doing is externalizing that carbon to another country. So we're displacing that carbon elsewhere. Now that is against all of every nation's policies in the UK. That's against our policies. So it probably isn't a starter, and we would need more land than we've got at the moment to reverse that climate change. The other problem, and which I'll talk a bit more about, is that how you utilize that grass. And if you use grazing animals on it, then you've got methane emissions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so this is the work we did with Hartbury. It's quite a big paper. We've got, there's much more to it this, but this one graph illustrates quite a lot of work we did. Now, this was also funded by FIPL, and we tried to combine our strengths. We're good at, the Wildlife Trust is good at surveying habitats and recognizing habitats. And we brought along Matt, who's really, really good at doing a soil analysis of those habitats, of those different habitats. So what we've looked at here, so we looked at 4 farms, all in the Cotswolds, just because, I mean, I've been trying to do a project in the Cotswolds. I've been trying to do a big scale habitat reversion project in the Cotswolds, which I've tried to get DEFRA to fund through their landscape recovery program. They refused 2 years ago for a couple of reasons I haven't got time to discuss. But in that application, there was equal weighting that the habitat restoration we promoted also had to mitigate for climate change, and there was equal weighting in that. So we were keen on doing a grassland restoration in the Cotswolds, because that's the big habitat. There's something in the Cotswolds called lowland calcareous grassland, which is a really, really important species-rich habitat, which holds so many insects and links to so many birds and wild plants, incredibly diverse. It's a very, very important habitat that has been, on the whole, lost. There are a few remaining examples, and I'll talk about that, and some good examples left. They're small and isolated. So this project was trying to do that. So in the process, we needed to think of ways of answering DEFRA's questions about how we would mitigate climate change. The project hasn't helped us very much. If you look at here, we've got 3 land use changes. Blue is arable land. Orange is, and these are, all of these are the range of organic carbon stock that are in the soils under those land uses. So we've got 3 land uses, and that's the organic carbon content in them at present. That's what they're at present. That's the time we measured them. and we've measured, say, arable, we've measured temporary grassland. Now on DEFRA's definition, that's grassland that's under 5 years of age, and then permanent grassland, which is over 5 years. But that grassland might be 10, 15, 20, might be 100 years. We don't know that. That was the problem. We don't know that. And that's been a bit of a problem with the results we've got. But what you would expect under sort of perceived wisdom is that grassland should have much higher carbon stocks than arable land, because that carbon has continuous root cover. It's not being disturbed. It's not losing its carbon. Why isn't that? If you look at that, there is no real significant difference between the arable land and the permanent grassland. Now, I haven't got a complete answer to that. I was very concerned about this when we measured. So the first measurements we took were soil organic matter measurements. They were the percentage of organic matter in the soil. So that showed us a little bit of a difference. And generally those grassland fields were a bit higher in that organic matter. That's not really much help in climate mitigation. We need to understand how much carbon those soils can hold completely. And so we wanted to know how much carbon was held in those soils, how many tons of carbon were held per hectare. So to convert that organic matter into carbon stock per hectare, we had to look at soil. It was a multiplication with soil depth and bulk density of the soil. And when we did that, it almost removed any difference between these soils. So you can see there's considerable overlap between arable land and permanent grassland even. There isn't any massive difference. So we could have taken an awful lot of arable land, put it into permanent grassland, and not really have a massive difference in our carbon stocks, which is quite alarming, because this is something I've believed through most of my life, that permanent grassland is going to be this answer. And actually what we're showing here, not a massive difference. The few things to bear in mind is soil depth in the Cotswolds. The soil is very, very shallow. It's about 20 centimetres. The soil in the Hartbury, which is the top right, that's more like 30 centimetres deep. That's more typical. So that will affect the carbon capture. The clay content, and I've already mentioned clay content, the clay content in Cotswold soils is much higher. It's again about 30% clay content as opposed to 20% in Hartbury. So you would expect soils in the Cotswolds to hold more carbon if we put them back to permanent pasture. My thinking, and I haven't got a solid answer to you, is that possibly a lot of that permanent grassland hasn't been down for very long. Although we're permanent, it's possible that it's perhaps only 10, 20 years old. And what I've said originally is this buildup of soil organic matter is very, very slow. It's tiny. So the yearly increments are small. So probably what we're seeing here is, although we're calling it permanent grassland, it's actually quite recent. So maybe it hasn't had time to build up those vast stocks. The problem is, relying on that, it's slow. It's going to take too long. And climate change is on us now. We don't have time to build carbon in that way because it is slow, very, very slow. There was a bit of information that I really wanted out of this project, which we failed to get completely. So I was interested in the difference between ordinary permanent grassland and the flower-rich permanent grassland. Very diverse. So all of the comments I see in different reports were, oh yeah, flower-rich grassland fixes more carbon than ordinary permanent grassland because you've got loads of different plants, lots of different rooting depths, blah, blah, blah. So that fixes more carbon than ordinary permanent grassland. No, it doesn't. Results show no difference at all in flower-rich grassland and ordinary permanent pasture. The problem, two problems in there. We've got very thin soils anyway. So talking that lots of rooting dips are going to give you very high carbon capture unlikely where you've got very, very shallow soils. Also, the soils that are species rich in the Cotswolds are often very thin, very steep soils which have not been converted to arable. So those soils are probably inherently always going to be low in carbon because they're very stony and not productive. So these flower-rich grasslands are full of a plant called the stress tolerators, and they really don't cope very well with competitors which thrive when they've got fertile soils. So we haven't got the answer to yet on species-rich grassland. Much more of that work needs to be done on other areas where I would love to prove a difference. The problems, none of the science, all of the reports I see, none of them are UK for the difference between species-rich and species-poor grassland. Okay, so we drew a bit of a blank on that one. A huge piece of work. We've drawn a bit of a blank. We haven't really got an answer from that yet. The other thing we did look at is the way you measure carbon in soils. And we looked at the three main ways that seem to be used commonly. So that's something very, very simple, basic way, cheapest way of doing it is called loss on ignition. Where you basically burn the carbon, take a soil sample, dry it, you burn off the carbon and weigh it, and you'll basically get an idea of, because you've burned off at not too high a temperature, you've only burned off the carbon, and then you convert that to soil organic matter, because you've burned off carbon, not organic carbon. But there's a standard ratio of working that out. So we looked at that as one method. We looked at something called, commonly used method is the DUMA method, where again you burn the carbon, but you do a spectral analysis of the gas that comes off, and you measure the carbon that's in the gas. The third method, so I ought to introduce this, is Matt and Wing here, who did the research and the photos. The third method was near-infrared, which they did live on fresh soil samples and on vegetation samples. Matt wanted to get something different out of this research. He wanted a link between soil and the vegetation above it, which I think he's getting, but that's another talk. That's a whole pile of different data. What we found is that not one of the methods is wrong. Really, it wasn't a problem with any. That they just correlated more closely. So if we plotted soil organic carbon measurements against the soil organic carbon clay ratio, we had a much tighter correlation with the near infrared than we did with DUMA, and then we did with loss on ignition. So there's a massive spread of points on loss of ignition, but you still can't say that's a wrong answer. That still gave you quite a reasonably good organic matter content. I mean, if we were going to do it accurately, we would use near infrared probably. But that means going out into the field with your piece of kit. Matt there, he's got the kit there with him doing that measurement. So that Wing has now published that, and she's going to a soil conference. Amazingly, that nobody's ever done that comparison. Loss on ignition gets loads of flack in farming around saying, no, it doesn't work in the Cotswolds. In fact, it's fine. There's no problem with it at all. I think we used NRM laboratories to do the loss on ignition one. Also, you can see on the left image, when I was talking about the grassland, the species-rich grassland, where Wing is with her orange jacket on, it's steep. It's steep and stony. So that's most of the species-rich we are finding in the Cotswolds are on those conditions. And our best nature reserves, the flower-rich reserves we've got, such as Daneway, are all on very steep fields that have escaped the plough and that have escaped arable production, really. Okay, let's rattle on. So there are good soil management practices. There are stuff we can do, and many farmers are doing them. From probably the results, not enough. So what can we do? And these will all help soil health, even if they don't do enough to help sequester carbon, but they will help, and accumulations of them will help. So there's things we can do. We can put organic amendments in. That's just putting manures and compost. That will, and if we manage it properly, they will become fixed into the soil. We can grow legumes. Things like beans, peas, clovers all fix nitrogen into the soil. So they're great for helping farmers reduce their fertilizer use as well. And we can grow cover crops. One of the big problems is the loss of carbon from bare soil. So if a farmer's growing spring crops, he can grow cover crops over the winter to hold up nutrients and to hold on to the carbon. You can do min-till. That's what I've got in the middle image there. That's a special direct drill, which doesn't does away with ploughing any cultivation. We put the seed directly into the soil without any seedbed preparation. Look, we can do diverse rotations. We can have periods um, of leys growing, of herbal leys growing in the soil, which will fix some carbon over time. And we can do what I've got here, agroforestry. Woodland is one of the answers to fitting climate. Um, and using those trees to fix carbon. Depends how we do it. It's great if we can keep that timber in the system somehow and not burn it at the end of growing them. Because a lot of fruit trees are very short life. A lot of orchards now, 20, 30 years, the trees are grubbed out and burnt, sadly. So we need to do something about that. If we're growing timber, or growing trees for timber, great, because that timber stays in the system and isn't converted to carbon. So those are a good use. There's not many examples of agroforestry in the UK yet. There are some where farmers are growing arable crops between fruit crops, and those trees will be helping hold carbon into the soil. It's not enough to mitigate climate change, I'm afraid. There are a couple of new soil amendments looked at, and these are biochar and also basic silicate rock. Now, some of those do look really promising on ways of holding lots of carbon in the soil, but they're not really well researched yet. So the work that came out of CEH yet hasn't really hasn't got robust research on that yet. But it does look like that might be one of the answers to fixing lots of carbon. All of these different systems have got really variable rates depending on the soil they're on and the climate. And they all don't really compare well to this 2.67 tons of carbon that agriculture emits per hectare every year. That's the downside. We can't get over this really high emission rate. So we've got to do something about those emissions if we're going to get anywhere near net zero in agriculture. So what are our emitters? These are our greenhouse gas emitters. I'm struggling a little bit to find reliable data on which of these is the most impactful. The AHDB, which is the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, they suggest ruminants are the worst cause because of methane, followed behind by nitrate fertilizer, and then by fuel and energy use. I'm unclear about that. I'm really unclear about that. Because I've used a couple of carbon. So there's a few proprietary carbon calculators that are being used. There's about 4 really that are meant to be the most robust. Now, they don't suggest that at all. Carbon calculators suggest that nitrate is the worst contributor to greenhouse gas emissions on farms. Now that's from nitrous oxide, so it's a greater greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, similar to methane. But what I don't know if there's a couple of things why nitrates are so bad, in that when the farmers use them, they release nitrous oxide, but their production, the way we produce them, has a huge carbon footprint. So the way we produce nitrate fertilizers is something called it's the Bosch, Haber-Bosch process, named after the scientist that created it. Now, this requires huge temperatures and huge pressures, which we create by using fossil fuels to create this nitrate fertilizer. And this is recent. Nitrate fertilizer is something very, very recent. Only post-war. We developed nitrate fertilizers as an explosive initially in the Second World War, and we learned this was actually quite a good plant nutrient. basically most plants growths are restricted in the UK by nitrogen availability. So adding nitrogen gives us these really fast growths. So it's used quite a lot. The economics of it is basically the limits of nitrate. So if it's too expensive to use and the gains in crop yield aren't sufficient, then farmers will stop using it. But how we mitigate all of this, I mean, oil use is obviously diesel use in tractors, high, plus energy costs in grain drying, milking cows, all of these things. So that's our next, that's direct CO2 from burning fossil fuel. How we mitigate the problem, there's nothing I've talked about mitigates yet for all three of those, that we can't actually get above these this mitigation. So we do need to change the way we farm. And it's still going to be really difficult if we do that. So cutting out the nitrogen fertilizers is easier to do. We know how to do that, and organic farms have been doing that a long time. In that we use legumes to fix nitrogen into the soil, and we can use some legumes to feed ourselves. Something we're not very good at in the UK actually is using combinable legumes, which is so. There's a lot of things we can. We can grow beans and peas. Combinable peas. Well, we can grow vining peas, but we could grow really good forms of protein in field beans and peas. Often they're called blue peas, and very seldom do it. They're difficult to grow in our climate to an extent, and the economics don't always work very well. But there is a company called Hodmer Dodds that is pushing it and trying to get this used and producing food from UK grown combinable pulses. So there's something in that. So we can cut out the nitrogen use. We will probably have to accept lower yields by doing that, and we can grow food crops less often in the rotation than we do by using nitrogen fertilizers. Okay, now what else can we do? We can have good hedgerows in our field. The hedgerows fix some, they don't fix a lot. I've got a figure here of about 0.1 of a ton per hectare of carbon per year if you've got 2.5% of your land under hedgerows. Woodland isn't bad at fixing carbon, but probably the highest sequestration rates in woodland is using a mix of conifers, fast-growing trees, along with our deciduous trees. That can fix up to about 1.65 tons per hectare. One of the real answers for me is wetland. And the wetland can fix really high rates beyond those average rates that we release from from farming. So we're looking, I've got figures here between 2 and 5 tons per hectare per year for wetland creation. The downside again is that we're taking land out of food production. Some of the floodplains are some of our very productive fields where we do grow arable crops. So by putting these floodplains back to wetland to mitigate climate change will impact probably food production. To be honest, in some of these areas, their ability to keep producing food is limited because the rate of flooding and sea level rise is going so high that we're probably going to be creating wetlands whether we like it or not. They're going to happen anyway because of breakdown of flood defences, etc. So it's difficult. Something that is happening in ruminants. So if we believe the AH to be ruminants to be this, well, they are definitely net contributors as the advancements made in feed additives to reduce methane production from erudition in ruminant livestock. I think it's something we probably do have to bear in mind. On a buy side, numbers are dropping in the UK anyway. Sheep numbers nationally are dropping as are beef cattle numbers dropping in the UK. It's already happening. Now, whether that's enough to have an impact, basically it's probably been from economics, that they're both systems of farming that have never made a huge amount of money. So that's quite a loss. That's where I'm up to then with climate change. The answers are not simple, not easy. I think even for farming to become net zero within its own sphere is difficult. Expecting farming to help our national greenhouse gas emissions, I think, is unrealistic. It's going to be so difficult to do that we're going to have to make decisions on land use, really, on what's important. But it looks, I mean, the UK will probably be okay to keep growing food under quite, land use, climate change that will really impact other parts of the world and its ability to grow food. It's likely the UK will carry on being okay. Southeast of England going to be affected by droughts more and more. But, you know, at the moment, markets are all global and we're quite happily importing. We're importing a massive amount of bread wheat at the moment because of poor quality harvests from the last 2 wet summers anyway. So it's a fact of life. We import our food, a huge amount of it. Biodiversity crisis. The UK, it's alarming. And I get quoted this from several people as well. We have the worst wildlife, the worst biodiversity in Europe. We possibly have some of the worst biodiversity in the world. It is that bad. It's that bad. We have a target set by DEFRA as well, which is called 30 by 30. And that's having 30% of land and seas in nature's recovery by 2030. We're actually, what year are we in at the moment? 25? 5 years away. We are nowhere near meeting that 30 by 30 by target. Farming here is absolutely crucial to actually halting biodiversity loss. It is fundamental. We have to have farming on board to do this. We, like a charity, we own, what, 1,100 hectares in Gloucestershire? By owning land, having lovely nature reserves is not the answer. It's not big enough, it's not effective enough to halt biodiversity loss. We've been doing that work since the 1960s. Biodiversity has declined continuously since that time. And in my lifetime, I have seen huge biodiversity losses. I can remember the farm I grew up on as a very, very different place to what it looks like now. And those are a few simple changes my dad were paid to do decades ago when he drained grassland, and we lost curlew and we lost lapwing overnight. Just like simple as that, very simple. So we're now in the process. That farm is now wetting up again, thankfully. So I'm waiting the curlew to come back. You'll be aware, hopefully, of the Lawton principle, where we need the needs of wildlife. So we need our nature reserves to be bigger, better, and more joined up. I would say we need to go further than that. We need farmers to have nature reserves as well. And that will be part because we just can't own enough. We need farmers to have really good areas for wildlife. Now, so the reason why we need farmers, they own the countryside. 70% of it is owned by farmers. It's that stark. So if we don't have farmers on board, we're never going to do this. Now, this is a lovely photograph here in the Cotswolds. This is not nature reserve, near is it a protected site in any way. And it's full of orchids as a pyramidal. It's lovely and flower rich. And this is because the farmer who's got it cares about it and wants this to happen. So we are not, as a wildlife trust, the sole owners of the wildlife. We're seeing quite a lot of examples of this in the countryside, in Gloucestershire, really. And it's there. It is there in Gloucestershire. We just don't always know about it. And we don't know what quality it is. So we're trying to correct that. But I've got a view in my mind, and most of this is being supported really out of the science that comes about what we need the countryside to do to deliver for biodiversity and nature's crisis. One of the simplest things would seem ridiculous is we need more flowers. It's that simple. We just don't have flowering. We don't have a succession of flowering plants in the landscape any longer. I mean, you can see acres and acres of arable land with no flowering plants at all. And what you might find is a whole pile of oilseed rape or linseed That's actually not really very helpful. It's a single flower species which suddenly disappears. So the insects adapt to it and they're using it, and suddenly it all goes at the same time. So what we need is this succession of flowering plants in the countryside, which you get from um, wildflower meadows. We need farmers to be we need farmers to be nature friendly in everything they do. I'll give you examples of that. We need larger areas of totally devoted to wildlife, which we don't have. That's probably one of the big reasons why our wildlife is so poor. We don't have any big, large areas of the UK which is totally untouched, which is totally managed for wildlife. We don't have a Bailiwitz, we don't have a Yellowstone National Park. None of that exists. Or even our big areas that look quite empty are impacted by farming, are impacted by sheep grazing mostly. So the big open areas of Scotland and Wales where we've got these big open mountains, they're grazed, they're influenced by farming. They're not managed for wildlife. There's a couple of other things we need. We need probably pesticide reduction, big time reductions in pesticide, and we need connectivity of the landscape. We need these hot spots, these good places for wildlife to be connected through the landscape. I've just noticed the clock and my time is racing. Sorry. I will try to be quicker. So we do need these variety of plants. We do need a huge array of flowering plants because there's something we should be aware of. This relationship between insects and plants is quite particular. So I could give you many examples where an insect relies on a single species of plant as its larval food plant. So you lose that plant, you lose Divilbit scabious, and you lose the marsh fritillary butterfly, because that's the only thing the larvae can feed on. You know, the lovely one in the Cotswolds is the we brought back the large blue butterfly. That needs time. Oh, and it needs marjoram probably in there as well. But you lose time, you lose marjoram, you lose that habitat grazing, and you lose the insect. Insects, we know there's been a huge drop in insect biomass throughout Europe, probably worldwide, but we know Europe drop. We know the UK is massive. I've got figures somewhere. Oh, can't see them there anyway. 60% dropping in flying insects in the last 20 years in the UK. It's enormous. It's huge. It's really, really worrying. Now, those insect biomass is so important for birds. Fledgling birds rely on that insect and their parents to be feeding them on insect. So that link carries on into the bird population, where our bird population is crashing because there's not enough insects. Bats rely on it. Bats are completely insectivorous. They can't grow without that. So we need these insects in the system. And we need a succession of plants for the insects to be there all year round. Our survey work, so the FIPL work we did meant we had time and we were paid to go out and look at farms in detail. And we actually did find a reasonable amount of grassland that was tending to species rich. So it is there. We don't know about all of it. It is a bit hidden away, but it's undermanaged. So one of the projects we need to do is to manage it so those flowers all come back. And at scale, we really need to do that because I've been quite clear, we need these flowers in the landscape because they're a basic supporter of our biodiversity. And the Cotswolds was once this huge area of calcareous grassland. Okay, so something we need to address, and the Wildlife Trust needs to do that. I think it's one of our projects that we should be looking at, is that we help farmers manage these wonderful habitats. We need nature-friendly farming throughout. So that could be things like low-intensity grazing. Really important that we don't destroy this grassland when we graze it. We need hedgerows back. The only picture I've got there is a recently laid hedgerow, but we want well-managed hedgerows that aren't cut to death every year. Occasionally, we may want haymaking. Haymaking's great. There's loads of annual plants that really thrive under haymaking regimes. But they're actually quite bad for invertebrates, so we need to be careful in the way we mow and the time of year we mow. We need farmers to give spaces for wildlife, for say lapwing to nest. There's loads of things they can do, and to be less tidy. A very tidy farm, which is farmed up to the edge, and the hedgerows are overcut, virtually find no wildlife in it. So we need these nature-friendly farming practices. Now, I am finding this everywhere in all of the reporting about nature's decline. So there's one you should be aware of, and it's the environmental impact plan. Now, this is it's an annual progress report against a 25-year environment plan. And this basically gives us a DEFRA report on where we're at with nature and how they're progressing their environment plan. Now, this is monitored by the Office of Environmental Protection. Would you be surprised to hear that we're nowhere near meeting those targets? So the one goal is thriving plants and wildlife. We're nowhere near meeting it, never are. But the one area that is stressed continually that if we want to achieve this is nature-friendly farming. It's a must. So Francis have to be the answer. We can't do nature's recovery without farmers. Okay, we need hotspots. We need hotspots. We need these really good areas where the main intent is to manage it for wildlife and not agricultural production. So we need more of these nature reserves. We can't afford to buy enough land to own enough nature reserves. So we need to make sure farmers have them and they're paid for them. So it is important that they're losing agricultural production and they're paid for them. Now, probably these are always going to be on the low production end of, the fields that were not the best anyway at growing crops. And probably morally, we shouldn't be taking very productive land out of production. We do have to think about our future of eating as well as having wildlife. But wildlife needs to move. It needs to move and expand. Quite often we don't understand how big a population needs to be. Otherwise it implodes, it gets parasitized, it gets predated, or it becomes there's not enough genetic diversity. We're at that stage with a lot of bird populations at the moment where the numbers aren't great enough to support themselves, and predation is so great that we're losing species. We're likely to lose curlew. That would be so sad. That would be so sad. The predation rate is so great, there's so few left that we can't really cope with losses. So we do need these hotspot areas. They need to be close enough up to be to connect up. But they also need to allow animals to move north with climate change. If the temperatures are no longer acceptable for them, they need to be able to move through a cooling climate. They may need to look at north-facing slopes instead of south-facing slopes, all of these things, but they need to be able to move to adapt. But we can do that. Farmers have got those slopes. We can do that. Pesticides, could be a whole hours on pesticides. So this is one example I've got from Dave Golson's, Professor Dave Golson. He's done loads of work on the harmful effect of pesticides. So this is one in particular, a neonicotinoid seed dressing. Now, this has made the press quite a lot, so you may have heard about neonicotinoids. It's been banned on flowering plants. Okay, so things like oilseed rape, it's banned on. We no longer allow that because we expect the seed dressing of neonicotinoids to get into the flower. It's only been just repealed. It's also been used on growing sugar beet, flowering plants. So that we've been given derogations on that the last few years. This time, the present government has said no to that. So we're not using it, but we use it on arable crops. So it's used on wheat growing and it'll be used on barley. And it's a prophylaxis. This means you're putting it on that crop whether you need it or not, which is never the right thing to do, never the right thing to do. But what Dave Golson found out is once that's on the seed, it gets into the soil, it migrates through the soil, gets into waterways and gets into other plants, flowering plants, and that's impacting the pollinators that use those flowering plants. So it's having a really, really negative impact. So we really do need to avoid pesticides in so many ways. The cost of them will reduce the need to farmers. So what we've been promoting within the wildlife trusts is a move to more agroecological and agri-environmental farming so that we're reducing these pesticide use. We have to do this. It's probably one of the major causes of insect loss is the use of pesticides. Also, if we overuse them, weeds become resistant, insects become resistant to them, and that's accelerating. So the most common used herbicide, glyphosate, we've had the first occurrence of resistance in the UK to that. There's been loads in America. It's been well documented in America, but the UK, we've had the first recorded resistance to it. And it's something that's used a lot within UK agriculture. Okay, let's keep going. So landscape connectivity, to be honest, I'm quite happy how we can do that. That's really easy to do. We can get support to farmers now. We can get them paid to have good uncut hedgerows and have flower-rich margins like this one. You know, that would give us connectivity through the landscape, probably the easiest way of doing it. And that's paid for by DEFRA schemes already. So we could do that. So I think that's achievable. We just need to talk to as many farmers as possible at scale to say, look, we can get you paid for this. It's a really good payment, probably more than you can make out of growing food crops at the moment. So why not? Oh, I've gone way over time, haven't I? You'll have to, if you want me to stop, please stop. But there's a little bit here on how this idea that's now embedded in UK policy and agricultural policies, public money for public goods. The term was used a lot a little while ago, and it seemed to have been dropped a little bit. It's still there. So farmers used to get a direct payment for owning land. Don't get that anymore. That's been cut and was cut quite severely in the last budget. What they do, they only get paid if they do something good for wildlife, or good to stop pollution, prevent clean water, or mitigate against climate change. The only things they get paid for. So we've got a couple of tiers. So the whole scheme is called ELMS, and we've got 3 payments. We've got something fairly easy to apply for called Sustainable Farming Incentive. We've got a much more ambitious countryside stewardship higher tier, which hasn't been quite launched yet. And then we've got the really big one, which is called landscape recovery, which is where my interest is, where we influence farming at massive scale and we try to do big changes where we lift the quality of habitat on a massive area throughout England. And I think that's, for me, the best way to stop nature's loss and to reverse it is to do work at that scale. I think there is a lot of there's a lot in the countryside stewardship higher tier that looks promising. The downside will be how slow the government is in getting it out to the farmers. So the last bit I want to talk about is a bit of work that I'm really proud of that the trusts are doing. We're engaged with this. This is called the Local Nature Recovery Strategy that's being done via the Local Nature Partnership. But this is done by staff, the GESA staff that share the office with the Wildlife Trust. Now, these are incredible. You've got some brilliant people, right? I can't tell you how great the minds that are writing this is fantastic, and how we look at the habitats that we need to restore within Gloucestershire, what species they support. Do we have to adjust that habitat management so we restore more species? And are there going to be species that we actually need to create special areas for anyway? Generally, my work in conservation, I work on a habitat level. Get the habitat right, and generally you get species right. Now, it isn't always the case. So these fantastic minds have put together this whole piece of software, which will be mapped, it will be spatial. So when a farmer wants to improve his land for wildlife, he will be able to click on the map and it will tell him exactly what he should be doing and what's the best thing to do in that area. And then the next step, which isn't there yet, is to how we could get funded. What all the funding is, options, what all the grants available are for him to do that. This bit of work is brilliant. I think if we get this right, we can really, along with landscape recovery, we can get nature's recovery on board. And if the payment rates are there, we can influence farming. So in my thinking I'm much more positive about nature's recovery. It's a slightly more complex issue to address. I think the message around climate change can be simplified, although it's not simple. It's easier for people to get their heads around. I think nature's loss is difficult to understand because of what we've called shifting baselines. The youngsters that come through the Wildlife Trust now never seen the countryside that I saw in my youth. They never saw the big flocks of lapwing, the huge the ground nesting birds that were quite common, because in that time we've paid farmers to revert land for production. You know, was the direction of travel on land use since the war, where we were more worried about food production than we were about the natural environment. We are reversing that, so I have hope for that. What I have less hope for is what we can do about mitigating climate change. I will leave it there.